Welcome. Let's get to it. This is an interesting story tonight we'll be working with because usually I have to summarize the sources and interpret them myself, but tonight I get to just read you the sources, right? And you get to compare them. So there are three main sources, and the oldest one for Orpheus and Eurydice is Virgil's Georgics. So this is 29 BCE. We're now in Rome. It's between the Eclogues and the Aeneid. We read some from the Aeneid last summer, which is Virgil's version of the Odyssey with Troy as the heroes. But this is a weird little book called the Georgics, which is about farming. Except it's, you got to watch farmers. They're very tricky. Hesiod was a farmer, and he wrote the Theogony, the birth of the gods. I don't know if you read Wendell Berry, great poet and writer, who's a farmer, and he's brilliant and just really incredible writer. Anyway, this is Virgil writing about farming, and you get this story. And in this story, just to kind of set it up, there's an interesting character named Aristeus who has messed up, and he descends to the home of his mother, the nymph Cyrene. And he's got to capture the seer Proteus. Now, you may remember Proteus. He's from the Theseus stories. He's the guy. He's the sea creature who keeps changing, so you try to hold him and he keeps morphing into something else, a wonderful symbol. Aristeus must capture him and force him to reveal which spirit he angered. Aristeus angered. So he finally binds Proteus. You may know the word protean, which means, rapidly changing. So this is Proteus speaking to Aristeus in the Georgics. Not for nothing does divine anger harass you, Aristeus. You atone for a heavy crime. It is Orpheus, wretched man, who brings this punishment on you. No less than you deserve it, the fates did not oppose it. He raves madly for his lost wife. She, doomed girl, running headlong along the stream so as to escape you, so that's the crime. Aristeus saw the nymph Eurydice, went after her, and here's what happened. Running headlong along the stream so as to escape Aristeus, she did not see the fierce snake that kept to the riverbank in the deep grass under her feet. But her crowd of dryad friends filled the mountaintops with their cry. The towers of Rhodope wept, and the heights of Pangaea, and Thrace, and the warlike land of Rhasis, and the Getae, and the Hebrus, and Erythia. There's a lot of local grounding here to all these stories. Acte's child Orpheus, consoling love's anguish with his hollow lyre, sang of you, sweet wife, you, alone on the empty shore, of you as the day neared, of you as the day departed. He even entered the jaws of Tenerus, the high gates of Dis, and the grove dim with dark fear, and came to the spirits, their dread king, and hearts that do not know how to soften at human prayer. See, I just want you to hear this because it's poetry and it's beautiful. Hearts that do not know how to soften at human prayer. These insubstantial shadows and these phantoms of those without light from the underworld came from the lowest depths of Erebus, startled by Orpheus' song. As many as the 1,000 birds that hide among the leaves when vesper or wintry rain drives them from the hills, mothers and husbands and the bodies of noble heroes bereft of life, boys and unmarried girls and young men placed on the pyre before their father's eyes. Round them are the black mud and foul reeds of Cocytus the vile marsh, holding them with its sluggish waters. And Styx, confining them, the river Styx, confining them in its ninefold ditches. The house of the dead itself was stupefied by Orpheus' song. And innermost Tartarus and the Furies, with dark snakes twined in their hair, and Cerberus, the three-headed dog, held his three mouths gaping wide. And the whirling of Ixion's wheel stopped in the wind. And now retracing his steps, he evaded all mischance, and Eurydice regained, approached the upper air, he following behind, since Persephone had ordained it, when a sudden madness seized the incautious lover, one to be forgiven if the spirits knew how to forgive. He stopped and, forgetful, alas, on the edge of light, his will conquered, he looked back, and now at his Eurydice. In that instant, all his effort was wasted, and his pact with the cruel tyrant broken. And 3 times a crash was heard by the waters of Avernus. "Orpheus," she cried, "what madness has destroyed my wretched self and you? See, the cruel fates recall me, and sleep hides my swimming eyes. Farewell now, I am taken, wrapped around by vast night, stretching out to you, alas, hands no longer yours." She spoke, and suddenly fled, far from his eyes, like smoke vanishing in thin air, and never saw him more, though he grasped in vain at shadows, and longed to speak further, nor did Charon, the ferryman of Orcus, let him cross the barrier of that marsh again. What could he do? Where could he turn? Twice robbed of his wife. With what tears could he move the spirits? With what voice move their powers? Cold now, she floated in the Stygian boat. They say he wept for 7 whole months beneath an airy cliff by the waters of desolate Strymon, and told his tale in the icy caves, softening the tiger's mood and gathering the oak trees to his song. As the nightingale, grieving in the popular shadows, laments the loss of her chicks, that a rough plowman saw snatching them, featherless, from the nest. But she weeps all night and repeats her sad song perched among the branches, filling the place around with mournful cries. No love, no wedding song could move Orpheus' heart. He wandered the northern ice and the snowy Tanais and the fields that are never free of riparian frost, mourning his lost Eurydice and Dis's vain gift. The Ciconian women, spurned by his devotion, tore the youth apart, and their divine rites and at midnight Bacchic revels, and scattered him over the fields. Even then, when Oagri and Hebros rolled the head onwards, Orpheus' head torn from its marble neck, carrying it midstream, the voice alone, the ice-cold tongue, with ebbing breath, cried out, "Eurydice! Ah, poor Eurydice! Eurydice!" The banks echoed, riverbanks echoed, all along the stream. Damn, that's good. And our old friend Ovid is back. The Metamorphoses, the largest compendium of myth that we have. Most of the myths that you hear come from the Metamorphoses. About a generation later than Virgil. 15 books, 250 myths total that go from creation to Julius Caesar, because they're both Roman writers, considering the end of history to be Caesar, for good reason. So this is book 10 from the Metamorphoses. Start over. Hymen, called by the voice of Orpheus, departed and dressed in his saffron robes, made his way through the vast skies to the Ciconian coast. So this is where Orpheus is from, the Ciconian coast, Thrace. That's also where Dionysus is from, by the way. But in vain. He was present at Orpheus' marriage, true, but he did not speak the usual words, display a joyful expression, or bring good luck. The torch, too, that he held sputtered continually and with tear-provoking fumes, and no amount of shaking contrived to light it properly. The result was worse than any omens. While the newly wedded bride Eurydice was walking through the grass with a crowd of naiads as her companions, she was killed by a bite on her ankle from a snake sheltering there. When Thracian Orpheus, the poet of Rhodope, had mourned for her greatly in the upper world, he dared to go down to the Styx, through the gate of Taenarus, also to see if he might not move the dead. Through the weightless throng and the ghosts that had received proper burial, he came to Persephone and the Lord of the Shadows, he who rules the joyless kingdom. Then striking the lyre strings to accompany his words, he sang, "O gods of this world, placed below the earth, to which all who are created mortal descend, if you allow me, and if it is lawful, to set aside the fiction of idle tongues and speak the truth, I have come here to see dark Tartarus. I have not come here to see dark Tartarus, nor bind Cerberus, Medusa's child with his 3 necks and snaky hair. My wife is the cause of my journey. A viper she trod on, diffused its venom into her body, and robbed her of her best years. I longed to be able to accept it, and I do not say I have not tried, but love won." He is a god, love, Eros, is a god well known in the world above, though I do not know if that is so here. Though I imagine him to be here as well, Eros, in the underworld. And if that story of the rape in ancient times is not a lie, you were also wedded by love. That's the Lord of Hades, Dis, and Persephone. I beg you, by these fearful places, by this immense abyss, and in the silence of your vast realms, reverse Eurydice's death. All things are destined to be yours, and though we delay a while, sooner or later we hasten home to here. We are all bound. This is our final abode, and you hold the longest reign over the human race. Eurydice, too, will be yours to command, and when she has lived out her fair span of years to maturity. I ask this benefit as a gift, but if the fates refuse my wife this kindness, I am determined not to return. You can delight in both our deaths." The bloodless spirits wept as he spoke, accompanying his words with music. He sang this. Tantalus did not reach for the ever-retreating water. Ixion's wheel was stilled. The vultures did not pluck at Tydeus's liver. The Bellides, the daughters of Danaus, left their water jars, and you, Sisyphus, perched there on your rock. Then they said, for the first time, the faces of the Furies were wet with tears, won over by his song. The king of the deep and his royal bride could not bear to refuse his prayer and call for Eurydice. She was among the recent ghosts and walked haltingly from her wound. She's still limping. The poet of Rhodope received her and at the same time accepted this condition, that he must not turn his eyes behind him until he emerged from the veil of avarice, or the gift would be null and void. They took the upward path, Through the still silence, steep and dark, shadowy with dense fog, drawing near to the threshold of the upper world. Afraid she was no longer there, and eager to see her. Remember that? Afraid and eager. The lover turned his eyes. In an instant she dropped back, and he, unhappy man, stretched out his arms to hold her and to be held. And he clutched at nothing but the receding air. Dying a second time now, there was no complaint to her husband. What then could she complain of, except that she had been loved? She spoke a last farewell that now scarcely reached his ears and turned again toward that same place. Stunned by the double loss of his wife, Orpheus was like that coward who saw Cerberus, the three-headed dog, chained by the central neck and whose fear vanished with his nature as stone transformed his body. Or like Olanos and you, his Letea, too proud of your beauty, he wished to be charged with your crime and seemed guilty himself. Once wedded hearts, you are now rocks set on Mount Ida. Ovid loves to do this. He loves to weave these other myths into each myth he tells. Orpheus wished and prayed in vain to cross the Styx again, but the ferrymen fended him off. Still, for 7 days he sat there by the shore, neglecting himself and not taking nourishment. Sorrow, troubled thought, and tears were his food. He took himself to lofty Mount Rhodope, and Hermes, swept by the winds, complaining that the gods of Erebus were cruel. 3 times the sun ended that year in watery Pisces, and Orpheus had abstained from the love of women, either because things ended badly for him or because he had sworn to do so. Yet many felt a desire to be joined with the poet, and many grieved at rejection. Indeed, he was the first of the Thracian people to transfer his love to young boys and to enjoy their brief springtime and early flowering this side of manhood. And finally, Boethius, the Consolation of Philosophy. We're going to do a section of this wonderful text this summer in our Passages series. 524, the Common Era, so 500 years later. He was imprisoned, eventually executed, so he wrote the Consolation of Philosophy from his cell. And it's a dialogue with Lady Philosophy about the superiority of the mind, of the influence of philosophy, especially in the time of death. And the ultimate theme here is that happiness comes from within. But in all that, in that context, Boethius decides to tell this story, interestingly enough. Could have told a lot of different stories, couldn't he, about the superiority of things of the mind. He decides to tell Orpheus and Eurydice. Happy is the man who can hold the clear fountain of the highest good and can put away from himself the darkness of his mind. We will now, from old fables, relate to you a story. It happened formerly that there was a harper in the country called Thrace, which was in Greece. The harper was inconceivably good. His name was Orpheus. He had a very excellent wife who was called Eurydice. Then began men to say concerning the harper that he could harp so that the wood moved, the forest would move, and the stones stirred themselves at the sound, and wild beasts would run thereto and stand as if they were tame, so still that though men or hounds pursued them, they shunned them not. Then said they that the harper's wife should die, and her soul should be led to hell. Then should the harper become so sorrowful that he could not remain among other men, but frequented the wood and sat on the mountains both day and night, weeping and harping, so that the wood shook and the river stood still, and no deer shunned any lion, nor any hare any hound, nor did the cattle know any hatred or fear of others for the pleasure of the sound. Then it seemed to the harper that nothing in this world pleased him. Then thought he that he would seek the gods of hell and try to soften them with his harp and pray that they would give back his wife. When he came near, then should there come toward him a dog of hell, whose name was Cerberus. He should have 3 heads and begin to wag his tail and play with him for his harping. Then there was the very dreadful gatekeeper, whose name should be Charon. He also had 3 heads, and he was very old. Then began the harper to beseech him that he should protect him while he was there and bring him back again safe. Then did he promise that to him, because he was desirous of the unaccustomed sound. Then he went further until he met the grim goddesses, whom the common people call fates, of whom they say they know no respect for any man, but punish every man according to his deeds, and of them they say they control every man's fortune. Then began he to implore their mercy. They began to weep with him. Then he went further, and all the inhabitants of hell ran towards him and led him to their king. And all began to speak with him and to pray that which he had prayed. And the restless wheel which Ixion, the king of Lapite, was bound for his guilt, stood still for his harping. And Tantalus, the king, who in this world was immoderately greedy, and whom that same vice of greediness followed there, he became quiet. And the vulture should cease, so that he tore not the liver of Tedius the king, which before had tormented him. And all the punishments of the inhabitants of hell were suspended while he harped before the king. Then he long and long had harped. Then spoke the king of the inhabitants of hell and said, "Let us give the man his wife, for he has earned her by his harping." He then commanded him that he should well observe that he never looked backward after he departed from there, and said that if he looked backwards, he should lose the woman. But men can, with great difficulty, if at all, restrain love. Well away, what? Orpheus then led his wife with him till he came to the boundary of light and darkness. Then went his wife after him. When he came forth into the light, then looked he back toward the woman. Then she was immediately lost to him. This fable teaches every man who desires to fly the darkness of hell and to come to the light of the true good, that he look not behind him at his old vices, so that he practice them again as he did before. For whosoever with full mind turns his mind to the vices which he had before forsaken and practices them, then they shall fully please him, and he never thinks of forsaking them. Then he loses all his former good, unless he again amend it. All right, those are the 3 versions of Orpheus and Eurydice we have. Who is this guy, Orpheus? Actually, he's a pretty mysterious figure. He is said to be from a generation before Homer, and I think you all know now, given this kind of stories we've been reading, that means he goes much further back than that, all right, or his story does. Because when we have a written text, it's emerging kind of like land out of the water. In a creation story, we're just kind of seeing something that's been hidden before, right? So Orpheus goes way back. He is either the son of Apollo or of Oeagrus, a Thracian king, and the muse Calliope. So we talked a little bit about the muses. Calliope is the muse of epic poetry, and so which was sung, by the way. And so Orpheus, and Apollo is the inventor of the lyre, and he teaches, and Calliope, his mother, teaches Orpheus how to play the lyre. It's a beautiful little story. He's the god of agriculture, writing, and medicine. Now, we've seen this before in our stories. Remember Ishtar, when she goes to Enki, she gets him drunk and basically steals culture from him. This is the same thing. This is a culture hero. We call this a culture hero in myth. It's the person who brings things like agriculture, writing, and medicine, the elements of culture that you need to survive that make you more than a guy running around in the hills chasing after nuts and berries and the occasional game. You're part of civilization. You live in a city, right? So who brings that to you? Who brings that knowledge to you? It was Orpheus. Oh, right. He's also attributed to have been an astrologer, a seer, and the founder of many mystic rites. Some of you may know this. And that is appropriate for someone who is a musician, right? You know the story, perhaps, of Jason and the Argonauts, who have to go retrieve the golden fleece. They, too, pass the sirens that Odysseus does in the Odyssey. Orpheus was there. He's a magician, so he's not going to do any work. But he does count out the time for the rowers, right? So, yeah, that's a good use of a magician on a ship. A musician on a ship is for them to count out the time. And then, of course, he saves the whole crew by overwhelming the siren's voice with his own music, so that the men on the Argonauts are not tempted to land and crash themselves on the islands of the sirens. Really interesting character. Some interesting stories about his death, too. Let me read you a couple here. One day, Orpheus was singing in a wooded glade when a group of Thracian women happened upon him. You kind of heard this in the other stories. It was kind of just very quick, but this spells it out a little more. These women were Maenads, devotees of Bacchus or Dionysus. And we're going to see there's this interesting connection between Apollo, who is his father in some stories, and Dionysus. And you may have read your Nietzsche, and you know what's coming. In their drunken frenzy, they threw stones and branches at Orpheus, and this is what they do. The followers of Dionysus just get drunk and go crazy, and they actually end up tearing people apart. You see this in Euripides' play, The Bacchae. But the beauty of his music stopped the missiles that they threw at him. They try and throw rocks and sticks at him, and the beauty of his music stops them. And so the pieces, the sticks and the stones were unwilling themselves to hit Orpheus. The women therefore began to attack him with their bare hands, tearing him apart. Tradition states that his head and his lyre were cast into the river Hebrus. You may have heard that referenced in the stories I read you, where they still gave out mournful music as they flowed to the sea and landed on the Isle of Lesbos. That's right, home of Sappho, probably the greatest poet of ancient Greece, that we don't know much about because her works are lost. But what we have is phenomenal. The river sank as the women tried to wash the blood from their hands. So the river just disappears, right? It doesn't want their blood, or doesn't want his blood from their hands in the river. And in fact, the river there does go underground there in northeastern Greece and disappears for a while. So you can see these are ideological myths. They're telling why something is the way it is, why poetry comes out of Lesbos, for example. Orpheus's shade then fled to the underworld, retracing his steps for Eurydice, and eventually found her in the Elysian fields. These are later additions to the story. And since Orpheus had been the bard of the Dionysian mysteries, the god avenged his death by transforming the Maenads into trees. This is a little bit sketchy. That doesn't make a lot of sense mythologically, but that's okay. We're just telling stories. Another story is that Orpheus has said to have shunned the gods, except Apollo, his father, towards the end of his life. And in one version of the story, Dionysus kills him for abandoning the Dionysian cult, the Bacchae. Still, other accounts say that Orpheus killed himself after his failure to rescue Eurydice, or that Zeus struck him with lightning for the crime of revealing the mysteries of the gods. And kind of like that one, it makes a lot of mythological sense because Orpheus saw what he wasn't supposed to see. And so the gods don't ever like that. Others have said that his wife died before him, there, as we know, and that for her sake he came to Thesprotis, where of old was an oracle of the dead. He thought, they say, that the soul of Eurydice followed him there, but turning around he lost her and committed suicide for grief, out of grief. The Thracians say that nightingales rest on the grave of Orpheus there and sing more sweetly and louder than any others. And then, of course, you may know that his lyre becomes a constellation by that name in heaven, and his soul eventually transported to the Elysian fields, where he keeps singing for the blessed. So once you're a great musician, you have to play forever. So the Orphic mysteries, very interesting, as I said. Apollo and Dionysus. So these, according to Nietzsche, and I think he's probably right, these are two principles. Like all pantheons, almost all pantheons, the gods represent principles. They have functions. And Apollo's function is order. Even though, well, it's because he's the god of music and created the lyre, that's an ordered system. And Apollo's the god, or Apollo and his consorts and offspring are involved in order and society, etc. Dionysus, however, is the god of chaos and disorder. He's the god of rage and sex and wine and drunkenness. And Nietzsche says that, Friedrich Nietzsche says that we have abandoned the Dionysian, and we are worse for it. And that we need to get in touch with our raging, drunken self, because without that self, we are not human and not worthy to be called human. And in fact, one of our most reliable texts from the ancient world, Apollodorus, says this: Orpheus invented the mysteries of Dionysus, and having been torn in pieces by the Maenads, he is buried in Pieria. All right, so there's that connection. Apollo as his father, Dionysus as his god, right? There's talk in the ancient literature of him going to Egypt, or being from Egypt in some sense, of being acquainted with the mysteries of Egypt. And we know what that means, right? So the Isis cult in Egypt gets transported all over the world. It especially gets transported into Rome, especially in Eleusis, and so forms part of the Eleusinian mysteries and becomes a cult of its own. And by cult, I mean religion with a certain set of rituals. I don't mean a weird group of people, although they were weird enough. Apparently there were these Orpheotelists. We have some reference to those in the ancient literature. An obscure set of mystagogues who, quote, this is from Plato, actually, who's not always trustworthy, by the way, who used to come before the doors of the rich and promise to release them from their own sins. That's actually genius, isn't it? Go to the rich and say, hey, I can get rid of all that guilt you have, but I'm just going to need some money. I guess we have that in, yeah, okay, we already have that, never mind. And those of their forefathers, by sacrifices and expiatory songs, they produce this ceremony, a heap of books, Orpheus and Musaeus, upon which they founded their promises. So they bring around books with the ceremony in it. I mentioned that about Plato because Plato is a source for this story, and I didn't include it because I think he's just got an axe to grind. We'll talk about it in a little bit. And then there's Orphism, which is really interesting. So there are these plates that have been found, these gold plates that are probably related to Orphism, these Orphic mysteries that involve instructions for what to do when you get to Hades. Right? Really interesting stuff. And here's one of the more famous passages. So they're gold plates that were put on coffins or sarcophagi, and it was like, okay, here's what you're doing. Here's your map, right? Because you're going to the underworld. Here's your map, and it's in gold. And here's a text. Here's what it says. You, the dead person, will find on the right in Hades Hall a spring, and by it stands a ghostly cypress tree where the dead souls descending wash away their lives. Do not even draw nigh to this spring. Further on, you will find chill water flowing from the pool of memory, capital M, memory. Over this stand guardians. They will ask you with keen mind, what is your quest in the gloom of deadly Hades? They will ask you for what reason you have come. Tell them the whole truth straight out. Say, I am the son of earth and starry heaven. But of heaven is my birth. This you already know. I am parched with thirst and perishing. Give me quickly chill water flowing from the pool of memory. Assuredly, the kings of the underworld will take pity on you and will themselves give you water from the spring divine. Then you, when you have drunk, traverse the holy path which the other initiants and Bacchants, followers of Dionysus, tread in glory. After that, you will rule among the other heroes. Okay, cool. This story, I was trying to look it up, see if anybody counted this. I suspect this story has been treated, it has continued on in Western culture more than any other Greek story. Now, I know we know Oedipus, but that's only because of Freud, really. I think in terms of the many expressions of the story of Greek mythology, I think it's probably this story. And that's not by accident, of course, because this is a story about creativity and creation. And so it would make sense that artists would be especially interested in this story. So let me show you a few. Let's see if this will play. It should. It's YouTube. I don't know if we'll get any sound, but no. Kind of weird without sound. Yeah. Well, this is Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, so it's probably good there's no sound to this, because if you know Nick Cave. But he likes rhyming Orpheus with orifice. Let's just put it that way. We read Rilke as often as we can here, and of course, he loved this story. Wrote a book of poetry called Sonnets to Orpheus. Here's a little taste of it. There rose a tree, O pure transcendence. O Orpheus sings, O tall tree in the ear. And all was silent. Yet still in this silence proceeded a new beginning, sign and transformation. Creatures of stillness pressed out of the clear unraveled forest from lair and nest, and it came to pass that not by cunning and not out of fear were they made quiet, but simply out of hearing. Below, scream, roar seemed small in their hearts, and just where there was scarcely a hut to receive this, a shelter of darkest longing with an entrance whose posts shook, you built for them a temple of hearing. Right? Rilke. Always good. Now, of course, if you've been here before with us, you know that we love Twin Peaks. This was an Orpheus moment in Twin Peaks, right? This is Agent Cooper leading Laura Palmer out of her hell. And if you remember the episode, he loses her. He says there in that scene, we're going home. But he loses her. Modern meanings of this story, so many. We are now in the realm of Western culture and myth, and I'm going to be showing you a lot more poetry and art like this, because the arts are the repository of myth in Western culture. We don't tell these stories anymore in the oral tradition. We tell them through our arts and music, art, dance, literature. This is where myth lives for us now. And in that, we find the Apollonian and the Dionysian, as I said, and as Nietzsche said. I think this is a story about order and disorder. And frankly, I think Orpheus created disorder, and he had to be punished because he broke all the laws. You're not supposed to go to Hades and come out, and you're not supposed to do that at all. So because you can play 3 chords in the truth, they're going to give you this pass, and then you're going to treat that like it's nothing by looking back? No, you don't get to have Eurydice. What's really interesting to me here is the liminality is creative space. A liminal zone is a zone of in-between. You may know a book called the Bardo Tadal, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It is a book about the between this life and the next. And there's a lot happening in the between, right? You may know this term in terms of ritual. When you're undergoing a ritual in general moves you from one state of being to another. If you're getting married, you're not married, you're single. Once you get married, you're married. The liminal stage is when you're walking down the aisle. And we know about liminal stages. They can drive you a little crazy because you're nowhere, right? You're in between. And in all rituals, this is the case. I grew up in the South. There was a Southern Baptist church right across the street from my house, and so I got baptized. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but they told me to do it, so I did it. But I knew something big was happening. And I remember Southern Baptists are Southern Baptists because they believe in baptism. So I was this kid, and I go into this pool, and everybody I know in the world is sitting out there. And this man puts his hand over my mouth and puts me underwater. And if you've got a good Baptist minister, he'll hold you there just long enough so that you understand what's happening. You are dying. I mean, that's the symbolism, right? So I remember that to this day. I think I was 10, and I remember that liminal experience of being in between a kid and then a kid who had been baptized. Let's not get into that. Those of you who are creatives, as we say, may recognize Orpheus's process as a creative process. If you look too closely at the process, especially if you look back at the process, you can be lost. I'm not a creative. I can write a few things. If I go back and question what I've written, I'm done. It's over, right? Now, I'm talking about in the final stage. Of course, you want to do that in the revision stage. And of course, there's a larger part of the process. But if you don't have faith in your process, ultimately, you can't emerge into the light with your creation, I think. For me, this story is about the gift that you have is larger than you. This creative process, and it doesn't have to be just creative, this process of becoming enlightened, because you heard the stories, it's about moving from darkness into light. That's a spiritual metaphor. That's a psychological metaphor. This process is larger than you. Again, this is just my interpretation, take it or leave it. But every time in my life, with my Southern Baptist heritage, when I've tried to control my spiritual development, say, okay, this is that, and now I'm going to do that, I lose it. Because it's bigger than me. It's bigger than you. People often, my scholarly area is Native American literature and culture, and people often ask me how a kid from Tennessee ended up studying Native American literature and culture. Once I understood it, I was immediately attracted to the fundamental proposition that I am not the universe, that the universe is larger than me. That we don't have in Western culture. Or we do, but then the God we have looks an awful lot like us. This gift, this process, whether it's enlightenment or creativity, is larger than you, and Orpheus did not see that. And so he tried to trade it, right? Also, it's about the descent and the ascent. We've seen this over and over again. You would see it in the Odyssey. You would see it in the Aeneid. You see it in Dante's Inferno. This is the hero's journey that we all know, that you must descend to your death and ascend. And if you don't respect that process, you stay or you die. You must understand what's happening to you. That's really what the journey is about, is understanding what's happening to you. And then, we haven't talked much about Eurydice, or Eurydice in Greek. Her name means wide justice. Wide justice. Isn't that interesting? For me, this is a Job story. And if you go back and read the sources, you can hear it. Orpheus believes he's been treated unfairly by the gods. And as we know, the gods don't work that way. You don't get a transactional relationship with the gods. Just ask Job, who did everything right. He crossed every T, he dotted every I, and he becomes the victim of a poker game in heaven. Because the Satan figure is hanging out and places a bet with God, and Job is the wager. And Job loses everything but his life. I think this is a Job story. I think Eurydice is about justice, and you don't get justice from the gods. Ever. Now, there's so many things we could read about Orpheus and Eurydice, the modern meanings, but I don't think you can do any better than Czeslaw Milosz, the great Polish poet. So I'm just going to take a little while to read you this because it's the best interpretation I've read, and it's Milosz, so it's fantastic. It's not too long, but I want you to hear it. Because he places Orpheus on a corner in New York. Standing on the flagstones of the sidewalk at the entrance to Hades, Orpheus hunched in a gust of wind that tore at his coat, rolled past in waves of fog, tossed the leaves of the trees. The headlights of the cars flared and dimmed in each succeeding wave. He stopped at the glass-paneled door, uncertain whether he was strong enough for that ultimate trial. He remembered her words, "You are a good man." He did not quite believe it. Lyric poets usually have, as he knew, cold hearts. Awesome. It is like a medical condition. Perfection in art is given in exchange for such an affliction. Only her love warmed him, humanized him. When he was with her, he thought differently about himself. He could not fail her now when she was dead. He pushed open the door and found himself walking in a labyrinth. Corridors, elevators. The livid light was not light, but the dark of the earth. Electronic dogs passed him noiselessly. He descended many floors, 100, 300 down. He was cold. He was aware that he was nowhere, under thousands of frozen centuries, on an ashy trace where generations had moldered in a kingdom that seemed to have no bottom and no end. Thronging shadows surrounded him. He recognized some of the faces. He felt the rhythm of his blood. He felt strongly his life with its guilt. And he was afraid to meet those to whom he had done harm. But they had lost the ability to remember and gave him only a glance, indifferent to all that. For his defense, he had a 9-stringed lyre. He carried in it the music of the earth against the abyss that buries all of sound in silence. He submitted to the music, yielded to the dictation of a song, listening with rapt attention, became, like his lyre, its instrument. Thus he arrived at the palace of the rulers of that land, Persephone and her garden of withered pear and apple trees, black with naked branches and varicose twigs, listened from the funereal amethyst of her throne. He sang the brightness of mornings and green rivers. He sang of smoking water and the rose-colored daybreaks, of colors, cinnabar, carmine, burnt sienna, blue, of the delight of swimming in the sea under marble cliffs, of feasting on a terrace above the tumult of a fishing port, of tastes of wine, olive oil, almonds, mustard, salt, or the flight of the swallow, the falcon, or a dignified flock of pelicans above the bay, of the scent of an armful of lilacs in the summer rain, of having composed his words always against death, and of having made no rhyme in praise of nothingness. I don't know, said the goddess Persephone, whether you loved her or not. Yet you have come here to rescue her. She will be returned to you, but there are conditions. You are not permitted to speak to her on the journey back, to turn your head even once, to assure yourself that she is behind you. And so Hermes brought forth Eurydice, her face no longer hers, utterly gray, her eyelids lowered beneath the shade of her lashes. She stepped rigidly, directed by the hand of her guide. Orpheus wanted so much to call her name, to wake her from that sleep. And so they set out. He first, and then, not right away, the slap of the god's sandals and the light patter of her feet, fettered by her robe as if by a shroud. A steep, climbing path, phosphorized, out of darkness like the walls of a tunnel. He would stop and listen, but then they stopped too, and the echo faded. And when she began to walk, the double tapping commenced again. Sometimes it seemed closer, sometimes more distant. Under his faith, a doubt sprang up and entwined him like cold bindweed. Unable to sleep, unable to weep, he wept at the loss of the human hope for the resurrection of the dead, because he was now like every other mortal. His lyre was silent, yet he dreamed defenseless. He knew he must have faith, and he could not have faith. And so he would persist for a very long time, counting his steps in half-wakeful torpor. Day was breaking. Shapes of rock loomed up under the luminous eye of the exit from underground. It happened as he expected. He turned his head, and behind him on the path was no one. Sun and sky, and in the sky white clouds. Only now everything cried to him, Eurydice, how will I live without you, my consoling one? But there was a fragrant scent of herbs, the low humming of bees, and he fell asleep with his cheek on the sun-warmed earth. Thank you. What a wonderful story, huh? Amazing.